Yeah, well, I'm Gary Koehler, and I got involved actually, I started dreaming about Big Creek in that Taylor Ranch probably after 1969, when Morris wrote the article about his cougar study in the National Geographic. I had a copy of that, and I think I still have that copy. And it was enchanting to me to be in the midst of that, such a huge wilderness area, and to do the work that he did, he and Wilbur were doing on cougars, or mountain lions as they're referred to here in Idaho. And I remember this picture in the National Geographic of Wilbur lowering this cougar that had been immobilized in this big ponderosa pine tree. I mean, and that just kind of set I still have that image in my mind, that beautiful big ponderosa in particular, and the cat, and the fact that Wilbur was up there and lowering this cat out of this tree. And so I had that in the back of my mind that, this is what it planted a seed, I think, in me about something to aspire to. And I had worked in the North Cascades since 1965 on trail crew for the Forest Service, and when it was called the North Cascades Primitive Area. And I kind of I wanted to see the whole North Cascades, so I worked on different ranger districts in that backcountry. And I was kind of running out of room. In 1969, a big chunk of the heart of the North Cascades was made North Cascades National Park. Spent a year there and didn't really like the bureaucracy. And so I think it was about that time too that Morris's article in the Geographic came out. So I thought, oh, that might be kind of fun to explore the northern Rockies area, particularly the backcountry of Idaho. And so I headed that way, again with the vision of Wilbur coming out of that big ponderosa with that cat. And I ended up working for the Forest Service as a wilderness ranger in the Selway Bitterroot, and then flew into Moose Creek and for a detail or training session, and that's on the Selway Bitterroot, or on the Selway River, and fell in love with that place. I mean, a ranger station out in the middle of an immense wilderness like that is pretty enchanting. So I applied and got a job the next year at Moose Creek as a wilderness ranger. And then, after stumping around that country, exploring and surveying for outfitter camps, I was in the higher elevations of Fish Creek, or Fish Lake, on the divide into the Locksaw drainage. And I thought, oh, I'd like to spend the winter up here. There was an old cabin back there. So I kind of knew nothing about pine marten. I thought, oh, this might be kind of fun to do a pine marten study up here, having no idea what a pine marten did. And so some colleagues at the Forest Service Fire Science Lab there in Missoula approached Morris about taking me on as a grad student. And so that was kind of my first official introduction to Morris. And he supervised my work and me in the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness, doing the winter work on pine marten. And so after that, after I got my master's degree, I was kind of footloose and not fancy free. I just kind of wandering lost. And a couple years later, Morris called and they says, "Do you want to do a bobcat study in Taylor Ranch?" And I said, "Yeah, that sounds interesting." And mainly my interest was in just being back there in the wilderness, and to spend a couple winters back there, and again being under the tutelage of Morris Hornacher, I mean, he was the top carnivore ecologist in North America, or one of the, and I mean, couldn't pass up an offer like that. So, I embarked on a 4-year study back there out of Taylor Ranch, looking at bobcat, and also it evolved into looking at the interactions of the other top predators back there, and that's the coyote and the mountain lion, or the cougar. And so I spent four winters, 4 years back there collecting data, and I didn't come out that frequently. Mona was back there with me at that time, and we lived in one of Jess Taylor's cabins, and spent 4 years working there in the wintertime, which was a neat time of the year. That's obviously the epic wilderness experience, is being in an area like that in the winter. And got my PhD on bobcats, wrote a couple papers on that, and as well as the interactions of bobcats and coyotes and cougars. And so it was about 20 years after Morris did his work in the 60s there. And so I was in there in the 80s. So that's how I got involved with Morris, and that's how I got involved at Taylor Ranch. Kind of not by design, but just kind of stumbling into those opportunities. And they've obviously planted a seed for me to continue work more with the top carnivores, top predators on the planet. And I've spent some time in Kenya, teaching at a university there, developing a program, wildlife program, and a graduate program there. And also spent some time in later years, after that, working for the Department of Fish and Wildlife in Washington State, doing black bear studies, doing cougar research, and also Canada lynx up there in the Okanagan. And after I kind of mingled that with a little bit more international work, spent some time working with snow leopards in Mongolia and Nepal and India, Himalayas. And during that, prior to that, I also did some surveys for tigers in central China, south central China. And so always intrigued by cats, and Morris obviously helped fan that interest. And so I kind of hung around Morris and his philosophy. I think that probably what you may hear, you've already heard from Morris, because that's the way life works. You know, he was my mentor for a good number of years and still is.
That was great. Let me just back this up a little bit.
You bet.
I'm not a videographer by trade. Something I stumbled into.
Yeah, kind of like me, life.
You know, it's none of our trade.
Mm.
Just making do.
Yeah.
Or it's not our trade by choice, I guess.
Yeah.
To go back to that idea of a kernel, and this image of of Morris climbing up a ponderosa to winch or rope down this tranquilized cat. What is at the essence of this kernel for you, do you think? Is it about, like, what is it, something to do with predators and just this idea of wilderness, or what do you think is at the center of that kernel?
That's a great question, and it's something that I really haven't thought about before, but I think that now that you asked it, that image of that ponderosa pine and that cat coming out of that tree in the middle of what was then the Idaho Primitive area kind of encapsulated everything that I had spent my life in the Forest Service working in wilderness areas in the North Cascades. And so I was really always stimulated by wild areas and kind of fancied myself as a devotee, or this is what I want to do with my life. And I met a lot of interesting folks in those wanderings. And so I think it was the mix of the wilderness, the wildness, I mean, basically the pureness of the planet in that area, and also with the cat. The cat is the quintessential predator on this planet, and you know, we humans are predators too. And I think that, and I like to hunt and I like to fish, and the cougar is the ultimate predator. And so perhaps in some ways it was kind of understanding myself, you know, as a hunter, as just my place on this planet, and where a better place would there be to make that discovery in a wild place like the River of No Return Wilderness, or at that time the Idaho Primitive area. And so I think it was that mixture, that it was kind of a mixture of kernels that kind of enticed me into that area, and being attracted by Morris's legend and Wilbur's legend in that area, and just to be around that philosophy. And I have long since left the wild areas, you know, the wilderness areas, but I'm still engaged quite a bit, mainly with carnivore conservation and management, and not so much in the wilds anymore, but doing a lot of politicking and lobbying for them, in amongst particularly our state agency of Fish and Wildlife. And so I'm trying to give a voice to the cats and the carnivores, the predators, because I've learned that they need a voice.
Yeah, I was going to ask if you found what you were looking for, or encountered that sense of self while out there those 4 years, and if that thing was what you anticipated, and maybe it is related to this idea of providing voice on behalf of something which is not human and not concerned
Yeah.
with us at all. Um, I don't know. Did you find what you were looking for?
I think in part. I think my role now is my feeling to give back to the planet, give back to predators, to carnivores, and because it's been an intriguing experience in my life, and they too are kind of mentors in my life, and how they can live amongst humans and be undetected. And and travel with a soft paw on this planet. So I think from those treks in the wintertime, you know, in the wilderness areas, I think that I've gained something by following their tracks. And now it is my role to give back to them what I have learned from them and try to be an advocate for them in wild places. But mainly my focus is on carnivores and how we live with them, or how we don't live with them. So, and I think that I'm trying to do payback. And that's kind of the way I feel about hanging around Morris. You know, he's been a friend, he's been a mentor, and now I'm kind of his sidekick, you know, following him around on his exploits and desires and travels and wanderings. And so I'm kind of, in a way, a partner of his, just making sure that he gets to the gate on time, you know, doesn't miss the gate, and et cetera, and spending time with him in the backcountry.
You told me there's nothing left for him to fish except carp.
Yeah, right. That is getting the way it is here. You know, unfortunately, I just came down the Clearwater and the Salmon River country from McCall, and to think that, you know, these rivers were teeming with fish, with salmon, with steelhead, varieties of salmon. And in fact, sockeye salmon, you know, making their 500-mile journey all the way to Redfish Lake in the Sawtooths is epic. And we have stopped that. We have plugged the river with dams. We have pumped chemicals in the river. We have drained it. We're dehydrating the landscape. And so that trip down the Salmon and along the Snake was kind of bittersweet for me, because to think about the history of that and the salmon runs in that area, and think about the way it is now, is absolutely tragic. And something needs to be done if we're going to save. Here we are, Morris and I, wandering all the way up to the Alaska Peninsula, out all the way to the Aleutian Islands, casting for Chinook salmon, what used to be prolific in the Snake. And in just a mere several decades, that has been the fate of the steelhead runs as well. And that is a tragedy. And we need to stop this. We need to do something. If we're going to have salmon in our future, in our children's future, we need to do something now.
You could probably argue that what you and Morris were after in Alaska was really just the Salmon River in Idaho.
Yeah.
Prior to its development and its colonization.
That is true. I think that what was searching for is just a little glimpse of what it has been in the past. And now, I mean, historically, there were tremendous Chinook runs in the Salmon, the Snake River, all of the tributaries of the Columbia River. Now, we have to go all the way into Alaska, into the Bering Sea, to chase these, just get a glimpse of these fish that were once plentiful here, and to cast them, look at them, appreciate their beauty, and release them back into the wild. And just getting a glimpse of what I think this planet has experienced in what maybe the last, hopefully not the last glimpses, but could be the last glimpses of some of these species. And I'm hoping that that's not the path of our carnivores, our predators too, because there is a serious onslaught of the predator control days of the early 1900s in the West against wolves, against cougars, against bears, their role in being predators. And it's a tragedy what we're experiencing.
What do you think is at the root of that desire to eliminate these top carnivores from the landscape?
I think that a lot of it is human greed. You know, we want either the game for ourselves, or by game, I'm talking about elk and deer in particular, and I don't mean to demean them by calling them game, but that's been a part of our lexicon, particularly in the West, for eons, if not decades. And I think it's competition too, and competition is part of life. You know, people, we compete against each other for jobs. People on the landscape, people that are natural resource users, and compete against carnivores for what they perceive their share of the resource. And so we cannot tolerate competition. And so I think in trying to safeguard too what we perceived are right from a biblical sense, and manifest destiny and all of those. So there's competition, and competition isn't a natural thing, but also we are smart enough to see what's before us in the future, and we have to come to realize that if we want a planet for our kids, we have to realize that we can't go unfettered in our competition and to control it, or to control the planet. Because all we got to do is look around us now, and the effect that we've had in this era of climate change, to see the effects of how we've influenced this planet.
Your Big Creek predator study found that predators are actually quite okay with a fair amount of competition until maybe the winter.
Yeah.
But for the most part, there's not a lot of conflict, is there?
There isn't. There's, like you say, even in the winter time, you know, that's how species evolve. That's one of the forces that influence evolution, is competition and predation. I mean, the beautiful elk and the deer that we so much admire are crafted in part by the forces of predation. Deer wouldn't be as fleet. Deer wouldn't be as astute at hearing, listening, seeing, smelling, if it wasn't predation. And so this is something that they evolved as part of the craftsmanship of the carnivore community, you know, influencing that part of evolution. So everything we really admire about deer and elk is thanks to the carnivore, the predator. It's craftsmanship and evolution.
Yeah, and I would say that if you disrupt that relationship or that craftsmanship, as you put it, then you really don't have deer or elk.
You don't.
You've
No.
got something else.
Yeah. And I mean, all you got to do is, for us hunters, is look at the common little snail or the slug. We don't pursue slugs and snails as a sport because they haven't gone through that same evolution. They haven't been crafted by these to make them, give them that challenge, to give these ungulates, the deer and the elk, that skill, that perspective of their landscape and how they are masters of that landscape. And that is crafted a lot by their interaction with predators.
Let's see. Let's see, hold on a second. Are there any particular memories or experiences that stick out to you from your time at Taylor in the early 80s, was that? Or
Yeah, it'd be the 80s. I think I spent 4 winters back there. And I think it was the camps, living in the middle of the winter there. And I think also, I like to track. I like to observe tracks and try to decipher what's going on when you're tracking an animal. And it's really a storybook, and I with a lot of stories when you're tracking a cougar that's stalking a small herd of elk or something like that. To decipher that, it is so, and I can still see those tracks to this very day, that impression. And so you don't need to be a wildlife biologist to get that sense of mystery and that understanding of predators. If you're an astute observer, you can make a lot of sense out of just tracking an animal in the snow. And I think that those impressions of tracking the first cougars back there, just by their tracks, left an intrigue by me, or for me, because I still use those skills, I still use that knowledge, and it's also, if you're aware of their tracks, and if you're aware of other signs like a scrape or a simple scat along the trail, you have an understanding about their presence. And the fact that they are there, you're not seeing them, but you know that they're there because they have left the sign for you to grasp and to become aware of their presence, and that this is their domain, because you're not going to see them without, the aid of technology and so I think it's like you said, it's the winter times, and because of that slate that it provides for tracking, and also the track itself, and trying to understand what's going on or interpreting the behavior within those tracks.
Sounds like a good book almost. It's almost as much imaginative as it is physical.
Yeah.
Can you talk about the bobcat that lived at Taylor for a spell?
Oh yeah, come here. That was spelled Kamir, but it derived its name from come here because we had no name for it, and it was kind of come here, trying to mimic a cat, but it was quite a more sent it in for us to get some understanding firsthand about just how cats move on the landscape. You know, in addition to tracking them in the snow, there's a limit to times with snow. And so Morris introduced us to this kitten that he got. I think it was from a zoo in the Utah. I'm not sure, or Boise, one or the other. And we raised it, and it lived with us in the cabin there at Big Creek, or at Taylor Ranch, and was part of our family. And you know, it was, well, I hate to say it was our kid, but it was an intriguing pet, and it did give us some insights into cat behavior that you couldn't observe otherwise. And but it became a companion, and we would go on hikes with it, and we would follow it around, and mainly, you know, cats are independent, and it would not respond to come here even if you called it, but you know, but it was Morris sent it in there to give us insights into cat behavior and an intimate look at the cats. And because we raised it does not mean that it was a domestic cat and that it lacked all the skills of a hunter, because even your domestic, your tabby cat, is a hunter. And those of anybody that has a house cat knows that. So it has those skills, and those skills are crafted by evolution, years and years of evolution. So it gives you kind of a sense of, a little bit of a sense of their evolution, and how they become the craftsmen that they are on the landscape.
Whatever happened to Khmer?
We took, after we left Big Creek, Taylor Ranch, and the study was over, Morris cautioned us about having basically a tame wildcat in our, you know, custody. And because of, you can't take the wildness out of a cat, just as you can't take the wildness out of your domestic house cat. And but you know, so he encouraged us to take it to a zoo or a wildlife park on the peninsula out of Squim. And so that's where we left Khmer. It was sad, in particular for my wife, but I'm sure he gave a lot of the viewers and the people that came to the wildlife park some joy, some understanding, and give them a perspective what cats do.
To shift gears a little bit here, what would you like to see in Taylor's future? Either like research foci, or just what would you like to see for Taylor?
Well, I think they've got a lot of structure there that is really and has been made a teaching institution back there in the midst of this wilderness area, to provide facility for young people to get a grasp, a little bit of an understanding and appreciation for what wild places are, and so it has a really fundamental value, I think, of education, and that's what we really need now, more so in this planet as we become withdrawn from wild places, just nature. And I mean, it's a um, real good facility for that. And also, there's countless research topics, particularly now with the effects of climate change on our planet. And that is as a laboratory where we know that our influence on the planet is universal, that you can't escape it from even the Arctic is showing signs of our hands. But also, I think in the wilderness area, you have basically a laboratory where you can control for a lot of other influences. Like here, there's no traffic. Back there, to have to cancel out or wonder about, how did these species evolve, whether it's Idaho fescue or if it's steelhead or bull trout or the red-breasted nuthatch, pygmy nuthatches. There's a whole variety of species there, and its interaction into the environment that it evolved in over eons. And this laboratory is seeing the effects of our hand as well, because this ubiquitous effect of climate change and carbon dioxide poisoning of our planet is, we need to get an understanding of the effects and how to turn that thermostat down. So I think that a place like Taylor Ranch has a possibility of providing an insight into the relationship between a species and its environment that you can't find elsewhere on the planet that is occupied by us, Homo sapiens.
Yeah, Morris was particularly interested in the idea of using Taylor as a launching pad for research into water systems,
Yeah.
and water cycles and things of that nature.
I think that that's a very important. The water is what sustains life. Water is what gives us life, and it's the watershed that provides that water, collects that water for life. And I think that is a very important element that you can't learn elsewhere, where we are present on the landscape. So that has a very important, and everything that, from the insect life within a stream, the fish in that stream, and the watershed itself serving as a winter range, forage in the wintertime for ungulates, and hence the cats and the wolves. So yeah, that is a very elemental part of an understanding that we need to get a handle on.
you have any particular big cat memories that stick out to you from your time at Taylor? Encounters or things you witnessed?
Yeah, there was one in particular. I mean, there were several. Every cat that we marked was unique, and they're individuals. It's just not a, you know, we the tendency to stereotype everything, whether it's different cultures amongst human cultures or animals, wild animals, and the individual behavior of individuals and how they see the landscape and how they hunt and how they live and how, if they're not successful, how they can die from an ill-placed stock, a poor attack. And but one in particular, I think, with Jim and Holly were away at that time, and they asked us if we could kind of just caretake. You know, we were back there anyway, and just watch the Taylor Ranch, and we had these camps, winter camps, tent camps, scattered up and down Big Creek from Waterfall Creek along the Middle Fork to Acorn Creek, and I don't remember how many miles that was, but anyway, but around Christmas time, my wife was with me, and we decided to go and check on one of our camps up above Cave Creek on Big Creek, and it was cold. It was something like 16 degrees. We had a cold snap, and it was in the teens. And I remember we had this one camp above Cave Creek, and where we were spending a couple nights just to kind of thaw things out. And I got up in the early morning, and it was obviously cold. The stars were just like diamonds up there, twinkling, and there was enough light from those stars that they were just casting reflections off the crystals on the snow. And I walked out to relieve myself, and I saw some fresh cougar tracks right in front of the tent. And I walked back in, stoked up the fire so my wife would have a warm tent to get out of the sack. And I said, Mona, there's some fresh cougar tracks out here in the snow. And I stoked the fire and stepped out again and looked down the trail to where I was, and there was a cat coming right towards us. It was towards our tent. And it was not more than about 30 feet away. And it was just coming, sauntering up like it was not a fear of anything, but it had this real curiosity to it. And so I stepped out and I said, Mona, here it is. And it couldn't have been more than about 20 feet away at that time. And it sat down in the snow in the middle of the trail. And then all of a sudden it got back up and started walking right towards the tent. And it came within, right at the corner of the tent. And to be honest with you, I was a little bit, kind of fearful. Not, I've been around cats some, but when you encounter that kind of behavior, it's kind of daunting. And so we got into the tent, and I was expecting perhaps this cat might want to come into the tent. And so I grabbed the butcher knife and expecting it to come in the tent, and it didn't. As soon as the light, it became more light, I was able to stick my head out and discovered that from the tracks that there was 3 cats there. There was a mother and 2 year-and-a-half-old kittens. And the cougars, the offspring, stay with mom for about a year and a half until, you know, the female's her size, and if there's a tom, and there was a tom offspring there, it's going to be way more than mom is. And she's, you know, hangs on to her kids and teaches them the trade of being a good predator. And we caught those cats later that winter and put radio collars on them. And sure enough, that's what it was she, the mother, and a female offspring and a male offspring. I think he weighed about 140 pounds, where she weighed about 80 pounds, and the female offspring was similar weight, about 70 pounds or something like that. But we put collars on them and got to follow their travels, you know, once they left mom. And the female, the kittens dispersed from the mother later that spring. The female went across Chamberlain, north of the Salmon River. It must have crossed the Salmon River in May, when the Salmon River's probably at flood stage. And but the cat crossed the river some point then. And the tom moved all the way and was later killed out of Drummond, Montana, which is like 160 miles away. And so that little glimpse of their behavior kind of instilled in me the first understandings of cat behavior, their sociology, their social behavior, and in fact how important that is to have that understanding in order to, if we're going to manage them, we're going to conserve them, to incorporate the cat behavior in that understanding about how to conserve, how to manage for cats on the landscape. Because what it means is that, you know, the young males got to get out of the area, because the resident tom is going to make sure, because if he doesn't, he's going to, probably the young tom is going to get killed by the resident breeding tom. And that's life, that's part of competition. And that also stirs up the genetic pot, you know, where the tom leaves the home area and takes that little packet of genes and distributes elsewhere into other populations, you know, within hundreds of miles away. And I've observed this in my further cat studies, cougar studies, and bobcat studies, that this is an elemental part of their behavior and an essential part of their evolution, and a view that we must include in the understanding of managing and conserving these species, is that, you know, there's a limit basically to the number of cats you can put on the landscape. And that is instilled in part by the big tom in the area, getting the young tom to move out, and that to minimize competition and to essentially in the long term is to distribute the seeds from that population to a much wider area and to exchange genetics with a regional population. So in that experience there, I've seen very clearly from subsequent cougar research that I've been involved with in Cle Elum, Washington, where we had a cougar project we called Project Cat, Cougars and Teaching, where we involved the kids from the local school into the project. And we had marked family groups like that. And the young toms have to get out of Dodge, basically. And I mean, they will go hundreds of miles from their place of birth to establish a presence or territory elsewhere. And that territoriality that Morris identified and described in Koehler in the 60s, he was the first to do so, is how important that understanding is into the management and the conservation of cougars. And unfortunately, a lot of management don't take those understandings when they're setting hunting season. They don't appreciate the behavior, those keystone bits of understanding about the evolution of these solitary carnivores, and into their management consideration, because there's a lot of thought now that cougars are overrunning the landscape, and there isn't that in the makeup of the evolution of cougars. They're a relatively low density species, and it's thanks to those big toms that keep the mix going. And that concept needs to be understood by managers and conservationists.
That movement of the young tom is not unlike your own dispersal to wilderness areas.
You know, that's a very good point. And in fact, I've often heard that that's the one thing that characterizes Homo sapiens, is the fact that they move like that. I mean, you think about the Polynesians and the Southeast Asians, exploring and settling amongst these little tiny islands in the South Pacific. How did they get there? Why did they get there? And why did Columbus set sail and stumble onto the Americas? Why did the Vikings, set sail and end up on Nova Scotia? It's some young dude that thought that they were curious about what was over the ridge. And that's how seeds get planted. Whether it's the dandelion, in their little drift for establishing themselves in a new home. The cougars that way, Homo sapiens are that way.
That night when you encountered the three cougars, what do you think the cougars were doing that close to you? I mean, while you were studying them, it seems they were also studying you in a way.
That's a very good point, because the old adage, curiosity killed the cat, is so true amongst cats. Trappers use that behavior by hanging a wing or a feather, by a piece of string, just to get the attention of a cat. You roll a ball across your living room floor, and the cat's going to charge it. And so their eyes, their ears are forward oriented, and everything about them is attracting or focusing on a movement. And that's how they become such efficient and effective predators. And so, but it's also curiosity and how they learn. And I do believe that that's another aspect of cats that we need to consider when we're responding to, so-called threats of cougars, is that cats are curious. I've probably seen, without the aid of hounds trying to capture cats, I've lost track of how many cougars that I've encountered without, just stumbling onto them. And basically that's what you're doing, is stumbling onto them. And it's because of their curiosity about you. And I've really become to realize how much they know about us because of that curiosity and because of their cryptic behavior. Being able to get a real close view of us, not because they want to make us dinner, but just because they're curious. And that story about, or that old proverb about curiosity killed the cat is probably true, is true, because, it's interesting. Now in the state of Washington, they're killing as many cougars without the aid of hounds as they did when they had hound hunting. And most likely, a lot of those cats are killed during the general elk and deer season. And it's because often cattle step out and an elk hunter or a deer hunter with a rifle is going to shoot a curious cat. And it's not because the cat has designs of attacking. It's the cat is curious. I've had a lot of curious cats look me over.
Yeah, unfortunately, for a lot of hunters in the West, it's been like drubbed into us that it's your duty
Yeah.
to control wolves or cougars.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think it's in part fear, because I think that's part of our gene pool too, is that when the days when we were just running around with stone axe and hand axe adze and stuff like that, living in caves, we had a right to be fearful of large carnivores because we were competing with them, on the plains of Africa. And, in the grasslands of Alaska during the Beringia period. And so it's probably somewhat in our genes to fear things with large carnivore or with large canines. And as dogs do, as all the carnivores do, have, and including us. And so I think it's probably somewhat in our genes, just like our tailbone is in our genes, just like our fingernails, vestiges of claws. There's a lot of vestiges of past evolution in amongst us. And I think that fear of the unknown is part of that. And but as long as we have this curiosity ourselves and want to understand more of our environment, I think we can learn and find out that, our fears are often not, justified.